back in 2016, there was a highly anticipated action movie that was released by DC that was called Batman versus Superman. Some of you may remember that it had Ben Affleck as Bruce Wayne, who, of course, is Batman, and it had a guy named Henry Cavill as Clark Kent, who, of course, is Superman. When the movie debuted, it had one of the biggest debuts in history. It grossed $166 million on its opening weekend before experiencing one of the most dramatic declines in box office history. In fact, that first week, from the first weekend to the second weekend, it's still the largest decline in sales in movie history. But even though it was considered a disappointment by most film critics, one thing it did do is that it reignited a debate that's been going on ever since the debut of Superman back in 1938. And the debate centers around this question: how is it that nobody ever recognizes that Clark Kent is Superman? Now, if you've seen any of the movies, you read any of the comic books, and you know the only disguise that Clark Kent ever wears is a pair of horn-rimmed glasses that are supposed to make us believe that even his closest friends and the people that work with him every day don't recognize him. So since this was a debate centered around a person that he was playing, the actor Henry Cavill decided to run a little experiment. Here's what he did. On the Wednesday afternoon before the release of the movie, he put on a Superman t-shirt and he went to Times Square in New York City. What made it so intense is that as he walked around Times Square that afternoon, he spent a total of 3 hours, and every direction you turned, there was a huge billboard advertising the release of Batman versus Superman with his picture on the billboard. At the end of that 3 hours, amazingly enough, nobody had recognized him. One of those hours, he spent the entire time standing underneath a billboard that measured 12 stories high that had his picture plastered on the billboard, and still nobody recognized him. When it was over, when his experiment came to an end, I want you to go to the next slide. He posted this video on Instagram in which he explained what he'd been doing. And then at the bottom, if you can see this, the caption says, "Dear Doubter, the glasses are good enough. Regards, Superman." Later, a couple nights later, he went on Jimmy Kimmel and explained what had happened. And he explained how, in his estimation, if Superman were a real person, like alive today, that he would be able to hide in plain sight because that's what people expect. If you have your Bible, I want you to turn to Matthew 21. This morning, we're kicking off a new series in which for 7 weeks, we're going to explore the events, the conversations, and decisions that occurred during the final week of Jesus' life on earth. And that means for this to make the most sense, it would be helpful like if you come all 7 weeks. Now, if you miss one, you can catch it on the website or the app, but I think it'll make more sense if you're here. And today we're going to start with the Sunday before Easter. It's historically called Palm Sunday, and we'll go through each day of the week, Monday through the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, until we get to the next Sunday, which will celebrate Resurrection Sunday on Easter on March 31st. And we're calling it the week the world turned. Because as you start to connect the dots about the things that happened over that 7-day period, you start to realize there was more going on than what most of us have realized. I love the way N.T. Wright put this when he wrote, "The resurrection completes the inauguration of God's kingdom. It is the decisive event demonstrating that God's kingdom really has been launched on earth as it is in heaven. The message of Easter is that God's new world has been unveiled in Jesus Christ and that you're now invited to belong to it." Our hope over these next few weeks is that as we explore the final week of Jesus' life, you'll come to a deeper understanding of who He was and what He came to do. But even more than that, we're hopeful that you'll start to see where you fit into the story and you accept His invitation to be part of this new world that He's launching. It's interesting when you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that each of the Gospel writers spend at least a third if not half of their gospel talking about the events of these last 7 days. You think about it, most scholars believe Jesus lived somewhere between 30 and 33 years. His ministry lasted at least 3 years, and yet when they sat down years later to recollect, to write their version of what they had experienced with Jesus, they all put most of the attention on the events of this final week. And that means there was something about these last 7 days that so captured their imagination that they could never stop thinking about it. And so our goal is to look at what they experienced and hopefully see how it impacts us. What you find at the beginning of Matthew 21 is the incredible story of a hero who, after years of literally hiding in plain sight, finally goes public, and he's finally recognized by at least some of the people as the long-awaited Messiah. Now, to understand what happened on that first Sunday, the Palm Sunday, before Easter Sunday, you have to get a little bit of the setting. So this all took place in the spring. It's all centered in and around the city of Jerusalem during what was called the Passover festival, or the Passover feast. The Passover was when all of the Jewish people would gather, as many that could. They would gather to celebrate and remember and reflect on God's deliverance of their ancestors from Egyptian slavery, which we read about in the book of Exodus. The Passover was also one of 3 Jewish festivals that every person who was able was expected to celebrate inside the city of Jerusalem. So what happened is, you have the city of Jerusalem. The population was normally around 40,000, but during this week in which they celebrated the Passover, it would swell to 250,000 people. So everywhere you looked, there were wall-to-wall people. It's kind of like, Times Square in New York City. There was nowhere you could go to escape the people. Adding to the excitement this year, though, in this particular year, was the fact that just a few days before this, Jesus had performed his most impressive miracle when he raised a friend of his named Lazarus from the dead. That happened in a little village called Bethany, which was located 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. So you can imagine, it didn't take long for word of what had happened in Bethany, the little village, to spread to the big city of Jerusalem. So now everywhere he goes, people are saying, hey, did you hear what Jesus did? Did you hear that he raised somebody from the story kind of went viral. And so people heard the story and they began to take that story and stack it on top of some other stories that they'd heard about Jesus. And now everywhere you look, people are like breathlessly anticipating the arrival of Jesus. At the same time that all of that was happening, there was a growing sense of political desperation that had engulfed the entire nation of Israel. Here are these folks. They had grown up hearing that they were God's chosen people. But now for several successive generations, they have lived under the oppression of some foreign enemy. First it was the Assyrians, then it was the Persians, and now it was the Romans. And so keep in mind sort of the irony of this. Here they are, they're celebrating the fact that God in the past had redeemed their ancestors from Egyptian slavery, while they themselves see themselves as slaves under the Roman Empire. And so everywhere they turn, they're waiting for somebody to come who can help them escape this and improve their situation. During those years, there had been several sort of would-be messiahs who had won some small victories, but nobody had been able to achieve the ultimate victory. And so with each failed attempt, the desperation continued to deepen. And now the question on everybody's mind, really two questions, is when is God going to save us like he saved them, and who is he going to use to do it? That's part of what makes what happened on this opening Sunday of the last week of Jesus' life so incredible. If you have your Bible, I want you to look at this with me. Matthew 21, starting in verse 1. Matthew writes, "As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, 'Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them, and he will send them right away. This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Verse 6. The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. Now, if you're tracking with us, here's what's happening. Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem is like the public announcement of his kingship. This is kind of like his coming out party. If you go back and you read through the Gospels, it's super interesting that up until this moment, kind of like Clark Kent, tried to conceal his identity, Jesus has spent most of his time trying to keep people from completely understanding who he is and what he came to do. And it's kind of weird when you read back through the story. He'll perform a miracle. He'll do something incredible. And most of the time, the first thing he tells the person is, now, this is great, but don't tell anybody about this. And then the disciples, there'll be like these private conversations, and the light will start to come on, and Jesus will say, hey, good job, but don't share that with anybody. There's even a couple instances where it says that Jesus performed these incredible miracles, and the crowd was gathered, and it says the crowd was ready to proclaim him as their king. And in a couple different places it says, but Jesus slipped away quietly. And there was something about Jesus. He didn't want people to get the total picture until the right moment came. But then as you get closer to the final week of his life, there's this unmistakable shift that takes place in which, after years of carefully concealing his identity, Jesus begins to tell people openly who he is and what he came to do. It's like after 3 years of his public ministry, he begins to make explicit what has been implicit during the entire time. And there's no better example of this than what happened during his entry into Jerusalem on the final week of his life, on the opening day of the Passover celebration. Here's 250,000 people all gathered. It says that Jesus started out in a place called Jericho, which was 17 miles from Jerusalem. The road climbs 3,000 feet as you go over those 17 miles. They finally arrive at the Mount of Olives, which is located just outside the city of Jerusalem, and it provides sort of this panoramic view of the entire area. Some of you have been there, and Jesus can look out. He can kind of see the crowds assembled. He can see the temple, and it says he sends two of his disciples into the city to get this donkey and this foal or this colt of a donkey. And it seems like a weird story, but most scholars agree it probably represents some kind of prearranged deal that Jesus had going. So they go, and they bring it back, and now it's time for Jesus to enter the city during the last week of his life. And that leaves us with a question. If Jesus is a king, then what kind of king is he? There are three things we learn from his initial entry into Jerusalem that will hopefully be confirmed as we continue to unpack these events in the weeks to come. But here's the first thing we learn. It's that Jesus is a courageous king. And here's what I mean by that. By entering Jerusalem in such a public way on the first day of a huge festival, Jesus is initiating one final showdown with both the Jewish religious leaders and the Roman political leaders. After 3 years of sort of circling around each other, of indirect confrontation, the time has finally come for a head-on collision. And if you remember the story of Lazarus, John chapter 12, it says Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, and the chief priests, of course, realize what's happened. They see that Jesus' popularity is growing, and it says at that moment they decided they needed to eliminate Jesus. They saw him as a threat to this delicate balance of power that existed between themselves and the Romans. And so from that moment on, they're looking for a reason. They're looking for a moment in which they can arrest Jesus and execute their rival. And make sure you understand, Jesus knew all that. There's nothing that happened during the last week of his life that surprised him. He knew that by going into Jerusalem, he was going to ignite a chain reaction of events that would end with his execution on a cross. You go back to Matthew 20, the chapter just previous to Matthew 21. He pulls the 12 aside and he tells them exactly what's going to happen. He says, Matthew 20:17, now Jesus was going up to Jerusalem. On the way, he took the 12 aside and said to them, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. On the third day, he'll be raised to life. Now you go back and sort of replay the events. This is the third time Jesus had told them exactly what was going to happen. And yet, just like the previous times, they either misunderstood or they refused to believe it. But either way, it proves that Jesus knew how this was always going to end. He knew how this was going to happen, and he knew that with each second that passed and each step he took closer to Jerusalem, how this was all going to end for him. I love the way a writer named Andreas Kostenberger put this in his book, The Final Days of Jesus. He said, up to this point in Jesus' ministry, he could have still managed to live a long, happy, peaceful life. But his actions on Sunday set in motion a series of events that could result only in either his overthrow of the Romans and the current religious establishment or his brutal death. He had crossed the point of no return. There would be no turning back. Caesar would allow no rival king. That brings us to the second thing you learn about Jesus. It's that he is a counterintuitive king. A counterintuitive king. I have a picture I want to show you. Some of you may have seen this. A few weeks ago, on January 14th, Denmark's 83-year-old queen, Queen Margrethe II, became the first Danish monarchy to abdicate the throne willingly in over 900 years. And even though she's still in relatively good health and her role, as you understand, is largely ceremonial, at the age of 83, she decided it was time to pass off the baton. So when she did, her son, the guy that you see on the screen, Frederick X, became the king of Denmark, and that is his wife, Queen Mary. They were introduced after he was proclaimed king to this crowd of over 100,000 people that were gathered outside their palace in Copenhagen. People were just sort of going nuts. From there, he gave a short speech, and then I want to take you to the next picture. They got in a carriage ride, and they rode from where they were a couple miles up to the road to the palace, what will be their primary residence. And as you can see, during that 2-mile journey, they're in this horse-drawn carriage. There are people literally everywhere lining the streets hoping to get a picture or at least catch a glimpse of the new king and the new queen. The Guardian magazine titled this, "A Welcome Fit for a King." And you see that and you think, yeah, that makes sense. Now compare that to how Matthew tells us Jesus entered Jerusalem. 200 years earlier, there had been a sort of a revolutionary leader named Simon Maccabeus who, after defeating the Syrians and keeping the Israelites at least temporarily independent, rode into Jerusalem on a war horse. And it said that people were so thankful for what he'd done, they were celebrating the victory, that they took palm branches and they spread them all over the road, and people were waving, they were celebrating the victory. But what happened to his victory is the same thing that happened to all the other victories. It proved to be short-lived. And now 200 years later, you've got another king, another person, another leader riding into the city, but instead of riding on the back of an impressive horse, he's riding on the back of a donkey. It's kind of an absurd image when you think of it. That's why when you get to verse 4, Matthew is careful to connect this back to an Old Testament prophecy from the book of Zechariah. 500 years earlier, there had been this prophet named Zechariah who predicted that at some point in the future, when the Messiah showed up and he rode into the city, rather than riding on the back of a horse, he would ride on the back of a donkey. Zechariah 9:9 said, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion, shout, daughter Jerusalem, see your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey," the colt, the foal of a donkey. So keep in mind, here are these Jewish people. They're celebrating the Passover. They're celebrating everything God had done for their ancestors. And for everybody in the crowd that day, they had spent their entire life hearing these prophecies, memorizing these prophecies, rehearsing these prophecies, dreaming about these prophecies. I mean, the image of Jesus riding into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, to them, should have been like a billboard. It should have been like Henry Cavill standing under a billboard with his picture on. This should have been an unmistakable sign that God was up to something and their deliverer had come. All the signs were there, and yet somehow they missed it. And the reason they missed it is because it didn't look like they expected it to look. My favorite writers, Mark Moore, said, Matthew shows that although Jesus is the Messiah predicted by the prophets, he was not the Messiah. He was not the Messiah expected by the people. They were waiting for somebody to come riding in on a horse. Jesus shows up on the back of a donkey. They were looking for a military hero to come in and defeat their enemies and restore their independence. Jesus comes in as a servant, and he seems much more interested in forgiving their sins and changing their hearts. And just like some of us, they didn't know what to think of that. Look at verse 9 at their response. Matthew 21, verse 9, it says, the crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven. Verse 9 is a quotation from Psalm 118, one of the great messianic prophecies from the Old Testament. But make sure you catch this. The word Hosanna that appears twice in this one verse is the Hebrew expression, what we would say, save us. So here, just try to imagine this scene. Here's Jesus, this 30-year-old guy on the back of this young donkey, and the streets are lined, and everywhere he looks, people are going, save us, save us, save us. They were right in that they knew they needed to be saved. They knew they needed a Savior. But they were wrong in that they had misdiagnosed the problem. They thought that what they needed to be saved from was something out there. It's who's in charge politically. It's the size of our military. It's the defeat of our enemies. It's the health of our economy. That's what we really need. But what Jesus said, and what 2,000 years later a lot of us still don't get, is that our biggest problem is never something out there. It's always something in here. The biggest problem is not who's in charge. It's not the economy. It's not our military. It's the sinfulness of our own hearts. And that's why so many of us miss it, because it's so counterintuitive. And here's the last thing we learn about Jesus from the story. It's that he's the king who divides the crowd. When Frederick X assumed the throne as king of Denmark, in his first speech that he gave on the balcony, he made a comment that seems innocuous enough, but some people in the crowd took it as a shot at his fourth cousin, King Charles of England. I got a picture of King Charles. Just in case you haven't seen him enough, like on the news, I want you to listen to this comment his cousin made. He said, my mother, talking about Marguerite, was like few others, one with her kingdom. And then he said this, I hope to be a unifying king. Now, on the surface, seems like an innocent comment, but some people in the media took that as a shot at his cousin, because if you know anything about what's going on in the English monarchy, King Charles has proven to be very divisive. There was a new poll that came out a few weeks ago in the Wall Street Journal that said for the first time in his reign, his approval rating is now 52%. It's been underwater the entire time. And 52%, I mean, actually sounds pretty good for most political leaders. But if you remember when his mother, Queen Elizabeth, died, there were a lot of people that were hoping that he would relinquish his right to the throne so they could sort of skip over him and go to his son, Prince William. Just as a side note, that same article in the Wall Street Journal said that King Charles's approval rating for those 18 to 25 is less than 20%. And they say it is a generational threat to the monarchy. Now, if you were here last weekend and you saw the kids' choir, I understand what it's like to have a son that's more popular than you are. Like, I get that totally. But this is King Charles. Everybody's kind of wondering how this is all going to play out as his approval rating goes up and down. Now, if you could somehow go back and you could track Jesus' approval rating over the last 7 days of his life, you'd be shocked how quickly it declined. I mean, from one day, they're celebrating his arrival. Everybody's sort of chanting and cheering and putting the palm branches down. A week later, many of those same people, after they started to realize that Jesus didn't look anything like they expected the Messiah to look, become increasingly disillusioned. And the same people that were cheering for him are now chanting for his crucifixion. They went from celebrating him as a king to demanding he be crucified as an imposter. And all of that division centers around one question. Check out verse 10, Matthew 21. When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred. And they asked, "Who is this?" And the crowds answered, "This is Jesus the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee." I love that line. The whole city was stirred. You couldn't ignore him. Like you couldn't escape him. Everywhere you went, people were talking about him. Everybody had an opinion. And the entire debate centers around the answer to the question, who is Jesus? And please understand, at this point, they had some information about Jesus. They'd heard the stories. They knew his name. They knew where he's from. The other Gospels indicate he'd been in and around Jerusalem for at least 6 months prior to this. So it's very possible that some of these people had already had a personal experience with Jesus. They may have had a conversation with Jesus. They may have been there standing outside that tomb when Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. I mean, they had a lot of information about Jesus, but they still didn't understand who he was. And they did not understand what he came to do. Some of you here this morning may be in that same situation. As you think back over your life, it's very possible that you've spent most of your life hearing these stories. You know about some of the things Jesus did. You know much of his story. But for whatever reason, you've never made a decision to place yourself under the authority of Jesus. Can I just tell you, if you want to experience what Jesus offers, you have to decide who Jesus is. And when I say that, I don't mean like, who was Jesus, this first century historical figure who said some interesting things and performed some interesting feats. I'm talking about, who is he to you? Is he just an interesting person, or is he the Lord of your life? I got one last picture I want to show you. The band's going to come. To me, one of the most tragic elements of this entire scene that we just looked at is that there were people there that day who were literally feet from Jesus, and they didn't realize it. They just didn't recognize him. 2 nights after his experiment in Times Square, Henry Cavill went on the Jimmy Kimmel Show, and he talked about some of the things he experienced. He said, even though it was, Times Square, there's people everywhere, there's billboards everywhere you look with his picture on it, there was only one person that even spoke to him. And he said he saw this guy coming, and he assumed finally, somebody has recognized me, and he's kind of feeling good about himself. But then this person came up, and he just wanted directions to somewhere else, had no idea he was talking to the guy on the billboard. He says, kind of a blow to my already fragile ego. But when the experiment came to an end, he put that video on Instagram. And what immediately happened is there were all of these fans that follow him there, and they realized what he'd been up to, and they flocked to Times Square. There was another lady, a young lady who was one of his fans on Instagram, and she made a comment 2 hours after he had gone that she was there with 24 of her friends, and they had their phones out, and they were scouring Times Square, one of the busiest places on earth, hoping that somehow Henry Cavill was still there. But he wasn't. He was gone. They had missed their opportunity. There's a part of me that wonders as the last week of Jesus' life unfolded, as they get to that next Sunday, they know about the crucifixion, they hear rumors about the resurrection. I'm certain that some of them ran to that tomb to to see if his body was still there, but the tomb was empty, which, opened up a whole other area of questions they had to answer. There's a part of me that wonders if they didn't think back to how close they'd been before and realize that they'd missed their opportunity, at least temporarily. I mean, they missed their moment. Here was the guy they had been waiting on their entire lives. Here's the guy they listened to the stories about as they were growing up, and then in the moment when they were, just close enough to reach out and touch him, they missed him. In the book of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah said this: "Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call on him while he's near." I want you to stand with me. If you're here this morning and you're ready to do that, you're ready to call on God, you're ready to seek his face, you want to talk to him, you want somebody to help you talk to him, maybe you're ready to make a decision to be baptized into him, to make a commitment that you've been putting off, we'd love to help you do that. If you'd like to do that, I'm going to be on this front row. David's going to be over here. If you'd like to talk to one of us or you're ready to make some sort of spiritual commitment, we'd be glad to talk you through that.